we try to give reason as people who live in a world of assumed rationality. We try to give reason to the past, but it is a time devoid of reason. No matter how rationally we try to think of it, you're thinking of people who knew they had to leave and wouldn't come back and would take someone precious, something precious. Imagine if people just were told, I'm going, you're going on vacation, take your clothes, and you never come back home.
Hey, it's Ramblings of a Sikh here with another episode of the Source Podcast. Today our special guest is author and historian Aanchal Malhotra, and we'll be talking about her new book, Remnants of a Partition. If you're new here, please make sure to like, comment and subscribe just below, and also make sure you watch this until the end because we really get to grips with her new book, and I've left a couple of bloopers in there. So let's get into it. So today I have the pleasure to talk to Aanchal Malhotra, author of Remnants of Partition, a book that brings sounds, sights and smells to life, exploring memories of partition through conversations about objects which are carried across the new borders. In retelling these stories, numerous complex tales are entwined amongst one another, creating a beautifully intricate tapestry of a time before, during and after partition. The way in which Aanchal retells the memories of those she talks to will strike almost every emotional chord you have. And just before I introduce Aanchal, I do have to admit I read the book from cover to cover, and I've never read a book that has triggered so many emotions. Now, I personally don't have much of a direct connection to partition, and what I mean by that is only 1 out of 4 of my grandparents actually experienced it. So although it's a memory, so to speak, or it's part of kind of the family history, it doesn't take as much of a central role as I think it does in other families. So reading through the book, there are points where you want to cry, there are points where you want to laugh, there are points where you're just astounded that out of some of these conversations, history that you just would have no idea just appears. It just comes. It's just born out of these people. At the same time, there is huge appreciation for what those survivors went through. And it was also extremely interesting to see how, no matter who you spoke to, there was a central kind of theme of gratitude, of thankfulness, of family. And most of all, something that really intrigued me was kitchen utensils played a massively central role to everyone's story. Now, that's something we'll get into later. So, putting all that aside, I just want to say thank you so much to Aanchal for taking time out to join us today. She's joining us from India, which is, I think this is the first person that I've managed to talk to from India. So again, thank you so much for joining. And from the introduction I've just given, you've obviously been someone that I wanted to talk to for quite a while. So once again, thank you for joining the podcast today.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for the generous introduction. And I'm always so moved to know how the book moves other people, because not only do we share so many similar feelings, but I think in doing so, we also build this kind of cross-border, cross-ethnic, cross-religious family of people who share memories of secondhand or eyewitness memories of partition.
I think also with the book, it really kind of kicked me into gear to think that there are so many kind of elderly relatives or friends or family members that we all know who have probably experienced a hell of a lot, or even if they haven't, they've still got some story or history to share. And I think one thing I took from the book, on top of a lot of other things, was actually just having that conversation with someone could make the world of a difference to them. And I think also one thing that makes the book truly kind of grasping is your kind of the way in which you kind of weave the words together. It's really quite difficult to describe. It's almost like poetry, but it's not. It's very kind of familiar. It feels like you're just sat there and you're recounting, oh yeah, I spoke to this person the other day, this is what happened. It doesn't feel like a heavy book, as in a book about partition. You'd expect it to be quite kind of heavy on the soul almost, whereas you're reading through this and it's like a conversation between lost relatives, and then key to this is this item that's in the middle that has kind of this weird and intricate history.
Well, I want to address that point because it was pretty, the conversational aspect of writing the book was quite thought out. I always knew I would do it that way. And the reason for that is that I don't know how it is when you grow up in the UK, but when you grow up in the subcontinent, if you're lucky to have heard stories about partition from your family, because already not everyone hears those stories. For instance, when I was a child, I never heard stories of partition, even though all four of my grandparents witnessed it. But the way we first hear stories about partition is in conversation. It is embedded into the daily life, and it's not about big things. It will never start with, oh, we lost this, or we saw this, or this dead body on this train station. No, it's always small things and always woven into the mundane aspects of life. Like my grandfather would say, in never diva dekile, like this big bananas. This was the size of the bananas we used to eat in Malakwa, and through that we understood that his childhood was somewhere else and the bananas were very big there. And I think that it has to be a conversation because it is only through these conversations will a multi-generational narrative emerge. Because that's really what we are trying to understand, how partition happened, but also how it continued to impact families. So I always knew that I was going to do it in this very informal way. Always knew that, and it's exactly how it happened too. I would usually go to the person, sit in their house, usually on the floor, because that's my thing, usually cross-legged. Um, and I would just talk to them about their lives. And we would never begin at partition and we would never end at partition. Partition would just appear somewhere in the middle because of the object that, as you said, became the center of our conversation.
No, that is amazing. Before we dig deeper into the book, as always, we like to kind of get an idea of the author, or in this case, yourself. And so I did a little bit of research before this conversation, and Wikipedia tells me that you were born in Delhi. I just assumed you were in London for some reason, and so that I apologize for that. And quoting a recent tweet that you put out, you mentioned you were someone born into a family-run bookshop. So before we get to know about the bookshop, I'd love just to know about you and your family history just prior to this kind of opening of the bookshop and everything that comes with it. So kind of how did your family end up where they were?
My family, all four sides, my paternal and maternal grandparents, their histories can be traced back to what is now Pakistan. My maternal side both came from Lahore, different parts of the old city of Lahore. My paternal grandfather came from Malakwal, which is in western Punjab in Pakistan. And my paternal grandmother came from the northwest frontier province, Dera Ismail Khan. And I would say that my paternal family was far more impacted by partition, the actual migration, the actual living in the camp, than my maternal family, who came a little bit early and already had family in India, so they were able to settle. They didn't witness any hardship as such. For my paternal family, and sorry to cut myself off, but that's also the reason that my maternal family talks far less about partition than my paternal family, because it really didn't impact them economically, or their foundation wasn't moved as with my paternal family. My father's parents both had very difficult migrations. They were both quite young. My grandmother was 16, my grandfather was 19. And these are really like formative years as a young adult for both those people. So my grandfather was in college, my grandmother had just finished high school, or 10th grade as it was. And both their families came to Delhi by train. They both ended up in Kingsway Camp, which was the largest refugee camp in Delhi, in the north of Delhi, in the area that is now Delhi University, or commonly called North Campus. So over there, it was a very, very large camp, and it was separated into lines. And those lines they had tents, they had houses, they had barracks, and those were given to you depending on your economic situation. So for instance, my grandmother's sister was a commandant at the camp, so she got a barrack to live, which meant the family would live in a proper barrack, a proper building. My grandfather, on the other hand, lived in a tent with his family and another family initially, and then they got a bigger tent, and then they got a house. So, I think the entire mindset of living in a camp, having lost everything, to be reduced to the status of a refugee, this is something that was really imprinted in their minds. And both my grandparents tried very hard to rid themselves of this tag of the refugee. So, my grandfather did go on to set up a bookshop, but before that, he did all sorts of really random things, because in those days, if you had just come to India or if you had just come to Pakistan, you were literally trying to get any work that you can so you could put food on the table. And it was literally hand to mouth. And in the case of my grandfather, he worked on the railway station. He sold railway seats, he sold coal, he sold uh, pens, he sold all sorts of things before he finally mustered up enough money to make like a down payment on a bookshop or a shop, really. And even for that, his mother had to sell two of her gold bangles. So it was really like a family endeavor. And then he ended up buying this bookshop, and he learned to be a bookseller really on the job, because he had this shop, it had shelves, the shelves were empty, he didn't know what to do. And he found his way to Connaught Place in Delhi. And in Connaught Place, he had an acquaintance who was also a refugee. And he went to him and he said, I have this shop, but I don't know what to put in it. What do I do? He was a math student in Pakistan, my grandfather. So he said that, like, I can't make a business in a shop teaching mathematics. What can I do? Help me. And this acquaintance said, well, I own a bookshop. And if you want, I can teach you to be a bookseller. This is the only thing I know. And my grandfather, who did not really have the luxury of choice at that moment, said, yeah, why not? And so, what this acquaintance did was he took titles off his own shelf and he gave them to my grandfather. And he said, start with these. So every day, my grandfather would get 4, 5, 6, 7 books and go from Connaught Place to Khan Market, put them on his shelf, and wait for people to come. And in those days, India had just become independent. The kind of reading people wanted to do was determined by that feeling. So people wanted to read about world politics, they wanted to read about economics, they wanted to read about, I don't know, the structure of the world post World War II. And so my grandfather, this young man, would sit with a pad of paper and a pen and write down what people wanted to read. So if someone said, oh, do you have, I don't know, Great Expectations, for example, my grandfather would say, no, we don't have it, but I'll have it for you by tomorrow. So he would write it down. And in his lunch break, he would go to Connaught Place, pick up Great Expectations, have it on his shelf the next day for the customer, which means that your customer is actually responsible for how you curate your bookshelf, which means that there is such a collaboration between the person who's buying the books and the person who's providing the books. And this little habit of this notepad and pen has continued till date. That's it. If you go to Bahari Sons bookshop, any of the Bahari Sons in India or in Delhi, we're only in Delhi, and you ask for a book and they don't have it, they're going to write it down on a little pad of paper, and probably by the very next day, they will have the book for you. So, certain things, yeah, I mean, it's also a family business, certain things have continued, but all this to say that my grandfather really didn't have the luxury of choice at the moment. He did whatever he could to get food on the table. And I think sometimes when he would speak about the camp, he would talk about food. Literally, he would talk about food and how they wouldn't, every day would be dal and chawal, but some days they would have a vegetable, or on the very rare days they would have a meat, or on the really big celebration they would have kheer. And I think that, I don't know, I always try to put myself in that situation and wonder how I would feel if I lost my home, if I didn't have any place to call my own, if I was in a new country trying to speak a new language, in a new profession, how lonely I may feel. And I think then about the family structure, and you mentioned that earlier in your introduction as well. It's really the things, the utensils, the food, the community, the intimacy of family that I always think about when I think back to Remnants, particularly my family, of course.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's an amazing story. I just think like out of such a kind of a tragic situation, um, for there to have been such growth, it's amazing. I think in a similar vein, it's very interesting in the sense that kind of a lot of the South Asian community can kind of appreciate that. So, like for argument's sake, my father's from Kenya, and so they had to migrate over here in the 70s when Idi Amin wanted to basically kill all the Asians or whatever. And again, grandma had nothing. Slowly, kind of built things up for her kids, and then continued to.
I mean, I think it's the same thing, and sometimes I think that these moments of upheaval can lead to so many possible futures. And for many people, with the partition of British India into India and Pakistan, it became an opportunity for extreme entrepreneurship. Something that my grandmother always says, she said it to me in Hindustani. She says that वहाँ पे पाकिस्तान में दुपट्टा था, they would be in parda in Pakistan. And then she said that in India, parda utar gaya. The dupatta came off the head because they had to work and they had to go out of the house. Whereas, for her, when she looks back at the migration, she looks at it as a moment of personal freedom as a woman, because she came to India, and yes, there was extreme economic hardship. There were all these young girls in her family, sisters that had to be married, that had to work, young single mother, no husband. And I think for her, because she had to work, because she had to provide for my family, my grandmother sees it as a kind of personal freedom, because she was allowed to go out of the house and she was allowed to earn. And you feel that kind of, I don't think I'm explaining this very well.
No, I understand what you mean. I think what you're pointing at is that for her, it was that complete change of structure, worldview, everything that went with it. Although in one sense it was kind of tragic and sad for her, it gave her the freedom to actually do things she wouldn't have otherwise, had the chance to do.
Exactly. She would have never been allowed to do. But the thing is, as I say that, I also want to point out that there is no one blanket experience of partition. And we should never think that because one person felt like this, another person will feel the same, because it's completely contingent on your mode of migration, your financial conditions, your family structure, your religion. I think that in doing my research for remnants in India and Pakistan and the UK, I really appreciated the different versions that make up the event, because without those perspectives and versions, you cannot fully understand what it did to humans.
Definitely. I think I'm certainly guilty of kind of having like a very generic blanket understanding of partition. So reading through the book, I was kind of surprised. I think there were two people who had said that they had basically had a car, and that was what had helped them escape or travel to wherever it is that they had to leave
Or a
from.
plane, when
Yeah,
people
yeah.
boarded the planes, I was
And
very surprised at that as well.
I was like, I actually had to check. I was like, are we still in kind of 1947? Because like it's just such a shock. But again, I think it goes to show that actually, although partition is in some of our lifetime's memory, there's a lot of it that has not been discovered or not been kind of shared. I don't quite know what the words are, but I think kind of the book really does help to bring out some of those nuances, and actually it's not just one kind of this is partition.
Yeah, I do think when I was growing up, the understood when you thought of partition, you thought of trains. Like that's the image that came up. And I think that it's really unfair that we immediately assume we immediately connect that image of the train with people sitting up on it, and the violent bodies on the ground, because to to retain the conversation of partition around the lens of violence is really to diminish the sheer emotional, physical, geographic, religious breadth of that event. And I think what I loved about Remnants was how varied each story was. and how fantastical the images were, because no one ever began with the word partition, they would always begin with childhood, or begin with fields, or begin with a ship or water, and then we would arrive at the lens of partition. And I think that even in my family alone, violence never makes up the bulk of the conversation, because it is painful to remember. And I think to myself, then how has this popular imagination of violence, percolated through all of our minds and come to dominate the image of partition? Why is it not friends being separated because of the border, or fiancés losing one another, or in the case of my grandparents, two people meeting and falling in love at a refugee camp?
Incredible. That is.
Human stories.
Yeah. Do you think, and this is kind of a bit of a tangent just of what you were saying, do you think that the kind of the predisposition to look at it through the lens of violence is almost like a colonial hangover, in the sense that there's always this kind of, or there was an assumption that Indians are, like, by default, we're inferior, we're more prone to violence, all of these kind of weird stereotypes that the British had. Do you think that the kind of the framing of that has, because it was obviously the dominant narrative, and also movies like Gandhi and whatever else that kind of portray a particular kind of view or vision. So I was having a podcast with Amandeep Madra about Jallianwala Bagh, and I had read Kim Wagner's book about Jallianwala Bagh as well, and he talks about how the Gandhi movie is basically...
It dominated our understanding of what Jallianwala Bagh was, even though it wasn't actually accurate.
Yeah, completely. And so do you think in a similar vein, it's kind of the same thing with partition? I'm not saying that the violence isn't part of it, it obviously is, but to the degree that which we focus on it, as you've already said, it's not necessarily the central kind of part of the narrative.
I find this question very interesting, because you're asking it from the lens of someone who has been born and raised in the UK. And I'm going to answer it from the lens of someone who's been born and raised in the subcontinent. And that's a very different perspective completely, because I think that in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we are so nuanced with our understanding of what partition means, because we live in it. We live in the aftermath of it. But for Britain, as you know very well, empire and anything to do with it in terms of even educating the population about it just began like a couple of years ago. You started from scratch. You're really at the beginning. So the argument is very simplistic in that part of the world. And I notice it when I speak to Kavita Puri, who is an excellent scholar of partition as well. She's written Partition Voices. She presented it on the BBC as well. And she says that every time that she has to talk about her book, she needs to explain to people what partition is in the UK. Whereas, going back to your question, living in India, why do I think that we have been shackled to the image of violence? Couple of reasons, in my opinion. One is, of course, it validates partition. It validates the creation of separate nations. Look at what happened. But the other thing is that we have been so focused on dates and percentages of people who were killed, percentages of people who migrated. I think that we looked at partition from a very, very macro lens. It's such a big, colossal event. When I learned it in school, I learned it as an appendage to the Indian independence movement. It was a very glossed over, granted, it was a really long time ago, in high school and in middle school, I'm talking about, where really students first learn what it means. And ever since then, if you're telling people, okay, independence happened and then there was partition, because that's really how it's taught. And if you only go over numbers and figures, X number of people migrated, X number of people killed, but you never actually go into the human stories, you're not going to create a human landscape of partition. What you're going to get is a statistical demograph, which is what I grew up with. So when I learned about it in school, my first instinct was never to come home and ask my grandparents, oh, did you live through this thing? Tell me about this partition. I never asked about it because it wasn't taught in a way that the event seemed mine. I didn't it wasn't taught in an impassioned way. It wasn't taught that like people migrated from here to there, and it was also taught in a way that made it seem so far back in the future that it couldn't impact our present in any way. Whereas, as you know, the after effects of partition are still very much ongoing when it comes to, geographies or even emotionally, empathetically, the relationship between India and Pakistan, the situation in Kashmir, the situation in the northeast of India. So partition is very much a process, an ongoing process. But I think also when we think of violence dominating the narrative, popular media has a lot of blame to take in that. Movies like Gadar, or even movies about India, Pakistan, the wars that India and Pakistan had fought with one another, they highlight that aspect. They highlight that difference, and never do they highlight the shared history that the countries once had, or the similarity that the common people still have with one another. I think the first movie I saw that actually did that was Veer Zara. I don't know if you've seen it. Shah Rukh
I
Khan presents it.
I have to admit, I've probably watched like half of a Bollywood movie in my whole life, so
Okay, well maybe
I apologize for that.
you should watch this film, because not only did it look at partition in an empathetic way, it also humanized the other. And I think that was a rare thing to happen. So what happens when we start to look at human stories is that we find we can't put them in the boxes of right or wrong, violent, non-violent, us or them. It's just very hard, because humans are complicated and their feelings are complicated, and you can feel nationalistic towards the country you adopted and still feel longing and belonging for the country you left, and both can coexist. But this conversation is deep and it takes time to emerge. And of course, the person has to be comfortable enough with you to actually admit these things to you.
Just kind of rewinding slightly, then, I found it quite interesting that you come from a family of booksellers. Or that's kind of like the family career.
Everyone dreams of being born into that family, sort of thing.
Well, maybe I don't know. Some people might.
That's what I hear a lot. Like, it's, because people assume that you can get all the books you want, but I want to make it very clear, I have to pay for all the books I want.
Oh, see, that would be my heaven. Like, you can see the books behind me. Yeah, well, you've answered a question that I wanted to ask later on, so no, you don't get the books for free. But just going back then, when you were growing, it's kind of, obviously looking back now, it's quite interesting to see that you've come from kind of a family of booksellers. You've gone on to write such a, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of other people's opinion, a very, very good, and kind of quite, in a way, I think it really changes or shifts the narrative, because I think, as you said, it's not statistical based. It's not about this is partition and this is the history that led up to it. It's a plethora of conversations with people who went through it. Did you always expect, or like, did you always want to write a book? Like, have you always been a book nerd? Like, as in, has there always been like such a put, like, because it almost seems as though on paper it was inevitable. You've come from a family of booksellers, you've written a book. Hey, like, are we surprised? But did you, like, when you were growing up, did you ever even think about it? Like, what was your kind of plan?
Not once, not even a little bit. I always wanted to be a visual artist. And I can say that with such conviction because I have this photograph of when I think I was 7 or 8, and we had fancy dress in school, and my mom dressed me up as an artist. I was holding I had a little easel, I had like a canvas on it, I had paintbrushes, and I mean, that was it. That was the dream. That was my actual, you're laughing, but that was the actual dream. And you know what? People often also assume that I studied history or English literature, but in fact, I studied to be a metal engraver. So I went to school to study visual art. I did my bachelor's in it. I did my master's in it. I studied engraving, lithography, papermaking, bookmaking, screen printing. That's my only education. Woodcut, traditional printing is what I studied in my bachelor and master's, and then I taught it at a university in Montreal. And history came to me because of need, because of necessity. because I belong to a generation that didn't know enough about my own history. And if I didn't know enough, then the generation after me would know even less, and history would get diluted to a point of being completely dismembered in some way. So I started writing because I had I had to. There was a need. If you come across stories that change the way you perceive the shared history of you and your neighboring land, then I don't know. I feel like you have to do something. You have to write it down. So I studied art. I never thought I would become a writer ever. It was never even a career option, and it was never even. I was never encouraged to either.
That's
You know?
amazing. So, what then spurred you to write? Well, first of all, what obviously you said it was kind of the realization that this history could be
Yeah.
lost. But what then actually made you go, "I'm going to write a book
Right.
on this"?
Right.
Because
So it was. I was in grad school. I was working on coming up with an idea for my master's thesis, and I had no ideas. And I remember coming home back to India. I was living in Canada at the time. I came home to India for a sabbatical because I said, well, if I don't have any ideas here, maybe I'll get some ideas at home. And I have a sabbatical year, and in that year, I visit my mother's family who live in North Delhi. And they showed me these objects that they had carried from Lahore to Amritsar. And they were so mundane. There was a ghada, which is a vessel, and a guz, a yardstick to measure fabric. And those had come from Lahore. And when they spoke about these objects, it was such a transformative experience for me to listen to it, because they seemed to be transported not just back in time, but also back across a border, and to a time when a border didn't exist. And it was so beautiful, and I just couldn't forget that an object had done that. And because I was in a fine art program and I was looking for a thesis, I decided that, okay, this will be my thesis. And I started to photograph objects that had crossed the border. And I had still no intention of writing about them by any means. I would interview the people, I would know the stories of the objects, I would write down little notes about them. But my main focus was the photographs of the objects because I was an artist. And then after I defended my thesis, and after uh, the program was over, I had all of these interviews with people in India and Pakistan, and it was just such a treasure trove of anecdotes and memories, and um, a time unmarked by borders. And I just thought to myself that I would be stupid not to actually do something significant to help. No, I mean, not just to help, but also just to bust some myths about what happened at the time, what our neighbors are like, because I'd also traveled to Pakistan by then. And the reception I received there, the people I met there. And I think that there could have been no other way to go about it. There is something about a book, like even when I look at Remnants in book form, I feel it is like an heirloom. It is like those things that you can pass down to people. And I was really happy to be able to have gotten that emotive feeling into the physical aspect of the book as well. um, so that's how I started writing, only because I had this plethora of conversations with me.
that's amazing. That is amazing. I'm glad you did because it's an incredible piece of work. So thank you for that one.
No, it changed my life completely.
No, that is amazing. Obviously, considering partition is a sensitive topic within India, and I noticed that there's also two different titles to the book. Um, Obviously, like what led to there having to be two different titles, but equally, whilst you were going through your research, were there any hurdles or surprises or kind of anything interesting that kind of turned up whilst you were doing this? I guess it's also that kind of you did your research by default and then kind of did the book in terms of you weren't like you didn't go out specifically to do the, if that makes sense. But like, was there anything where you went, oh, like that's like I never knew that, or something that kind of just made you stop and pay attention?
Almost on an everyday basis. And I think that this is, you've hit such a wonderful point in Remnants, that it sort of compels you to unlearn. it compels you. You have to unlearn everything, or maybe at least some things that you know, in order to relearn things from a different perspective. And I think that there are so many things, about being a young female field researcher that you don't quite expect. For instance, I was 23 when I started out. And I remember my first trip to Pakistan where everyone was very surprised that a young Indian girl has come all by herself for the first time to Pakistan. And people would constantly ask me, how does it feel to be an Indian in Pakistan? And I would always say, it feels pretty much the same. Because it did, and I think that this is going to be my greatest takeaway, that um, the hearts of common people cannot be divided as easily as geography or government. It's never, Indians and Pakistanis, as people, we are so similar. And you live in the UK, you probably witness it every day. There is something so almost mythical that binds us together, that cannot be broken by the radcliffe line that runs through us. It just can't. When I am in London, or if I am in America and I hear someone speaking Punjabi or Urdu, I don't care whether they're an Indian or a Pakistani. And I just get that that language is mine. And it's here in this foreign land. And I embrace it as my own, So I think there were so many things that I learned with people that I okay, let me just think about this for a minute. When you grow up in a certain country with a certain upbringing, in a certain religion, there are things that you don't understand, that you're already prejudiced about. Prejudice is internal, it happens to all of us. When I was researching Remnants, there were things about fundamental things that were questioned on an everyday basis. And I was forced to unlearn because of the different perspectives of the people I was interviewing. And I'm much richer for that. And I hope that people, when they read the book, they are also much richer for it. But the difference also in perspectives of Indians and Pakistanis was brought out a lot. Indians always talked about loss. They lost land, they lost home. Pakistanis, while talking about loss, also talked about the gaining of nationhood and statehood and country. So these perspectives are very important to put in. And I think what I learned was, even if you may not agree with someone's story, it is not yours to contort. So you must put it in the way that they want, in the words that they are using. And I hope I was able to do that. To your point of the different titles, this is something that causes massive confusion with readers, because sometimes they buy both books, and I feel really bad because you have, well, I mean, you're a collector now, but you just have the same book. So the project was always Remnants of a Separation, because and Remnants of a Separation is the title in South Asia. My thesis was called Remnants of a Separation. The book in India, published by HarperCollins, is also called Remnants of a Separation. And the reason for that is growing up in South Asia, growing up with Pakistan as a neighbor, I always thought, now after I've done research on partition, I think of partition not as a divorce between India and Pakistan. I think of it as it's like a pause. Not to say that the land masses of India and Pakistan will ever come together as one unified landmass. That will never happen. But I think that there is potential and there is hope for us to come together emotionally and just as people, conversationally, culturally. There's just so much potential for that. So I call it a separation because it's not completely fractured yet. That was my understanding for the word separation in Remnants of a Separation. When it comes to the rest of the world, though, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, the editions in all of those places are called Remnants of Partition. And the reason for that is, outside the subcontinent, people understand partition as the partition of British India. They associate it to the year 1947. There is an immediate recognizability of the event, and it's far more direct.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so that was it.
That makes perfect sense, and you're completely right, because had I seen Remnants of a Separation on
You
a
wouldn't know.
bookshelf, no. I probably would have assumed it's something to do with someone's divorce. Like, I'll be quite honest. So you're definitely right. And whereas Remnants of a Partition, automatically I was like, yeah, I know what this is about. So absolutely bang on there.
So my publisher suggested it, and I think that it works really well.
Yeah.
It works really well, but sometimes it does confuse people, the two editions.
Yeah. Well, I guess hopefully they'll listen to this and it'll all be cleared up. So
I hope so too.
Just then continuing that, I think one thing that your book does a really good job of is showing how these really kind of everyday material, mundane objects almost, that I think I don't think anyone, when I say anyone, I don't think there are many people who are going to listen to this podcast who have ever been in a situation where you've had to literally grab the most important thing that you own. And it's interesting when you're reading that book because I kept thinking, like, what would I take?
What would you carry?
Yeah, like what would you carry? What would you take? Why would you take it? Because I was like, right, why would I take a car? Well, no, I can only get it so far, then I have to get paid. Like there's all these like processes which I was trying to go through to kind of figure out what the correct thing was.
Do you know what? The other thing is that we try to give reason as people who live in a world of or assumed rationality. We try to give reason to the past, but it is a time devoid of reason. I have to tell you that. So no matter how rationally we try to think of it, you're thinking of people who knew they had to leave and wouldn't come back and would take something precious. Imagine if people just were told, I'm going, you're going on vacation, take your clothes, and you never come back home after that vacation, So I would say don't think of it rationally because it's an irrational time.
Completely. And I think it was interesting that a lot of people's assumptions were they were going to come back. And I think that obviously plays. I think also for me, the parallels with like my own family history in terms of when my grandma moved over, well, when I say moved, like immigrated over from Kenya, they again had nothing. And it was like, all right, what do we take? And it was literally the clothes on their back. And so, yeah, you are correct. They were like, I was trying to rationalize it and you'd be like, that doesn't work. And actually, you're correct. It is a moment of just instinct and survival. So it was also interesting to see how these objects became symbols of things that are far deeper and kind of reflective or representative of a past, whatever that might kind of exemplify. What for you, though, during all of your research and all of the conversations you had with these people was one item that stood out the most and why?
But you're asking me to choose.
Yeah. I knew this was going to be difficult, but I also just wanted to see your like reasoning behind why particularly one item or another, or maybe a couple of items stood out.
Well, okay, so I'll tell you about what is dearest to me, and then I'll also tell you about the most bizarre thing. And we can start with the most bizarre thing because it is really bizarre. So obviously people carried like ordinary things like, household items and money and jewelry, because these were monetarily valuable things that they could either sell or mortgage on the other side. But then there were bizarre things that people carry. For instance, I was in a house in Lahore and they showed me, how people have like lions' heads on the wall? And tigers' heads and all that stuff. Okay, well, they had a stuffed crocodile. And I touched its tooth, and it had like shrunk over the last 70 years. But in the years before partition, there was the man who killed this crocodile lived in a village on the banks of the river Bias in India. And there was a man-eating crocodile who would eat the washermen who came to wash their clothes at this river. And he had eaten like 3 or 4 of them, and the villagers were really like scared and they were worried. And so this man says that I am going to kill this crocodile, and he stalks the crocodile for a couple of weeks and he maps its movement, and then he kills it. And it's so large, it's 15.5 feet long, that it requires 2 bullock carts to carry him to the village. In the village, he is put on display. All the children of those dhobis, the washermen, they come and touch it to make sure he's dead, their deaths have been avenged. And then eventually this crocodile is skinned and gutted and taxidermied, and the head is put up on the, on the wall, and the skin is rolled up. I know, I'm sorry, this is such an elaborate story.
It's a really good story.
So then partition happens, and this gentleman is like, well, I'm going to Pakistan, and this crocodile skin and head is obviously precious to me because it I did this. So he picks up the head, he rolls up the skin, and he takes it to Pakistan, where in Lahore, in a house in Gulbarg, it is on the wall. And I just thought it was such a weird thing, because on one hand, people were telling you stories that, we brought our plates, and we brought our jewelry, and we brought our books, and then this gentleman was like, well, I brought my crocodile head. So it should really put things into perspective about what's precious.
Yeah, and it goes back to your point earlier about rationality and about like picking the item.
Also, I mean, I want to say that what someone carried and how much of what they carried will tell you how much they knew about partition. This gentleman who could carry his crocodile head obviously knew partition was permanent. So along with the crocodile head, he sent furniture, he sent everything in a goods train to Pakistan. That meant also that he had wealth enough to do so. People like my grandfather's family who carried utensils may not have thought it was permanent, so they only took, bartan. They took utensils that they could cook in temporarily. But imagine a person who didn't expect to leave their house and had to leave at like literally a moment's notice. Would the dupatta they're wearing become that heirloom? Would the jewelry they're wearing become home, like be elevated to the status of home, So I think about these things a lot. But my favorite object, my grandmother's mother carried a piece of jewelry, which was a mangtika, to be worn on the head, and it had been given to her at her wedding in 1912. It's over 100 years old now. And she carried it because she wanted to sell it. She was a single mother. My grandmother was 16. I don't think she ever knew her father, actually. She was very young when he died. And my great grandmother said, well, we're going to go to India, and this is a precious piece of jewelry, and I'm going to sell it to be able to educate my children and feed us. And she never sold it. And she held on to it. And it was because she found a job as a teacher in India that she could afford to hold on to it. And then she passed it down to my grandmother on her wedding. And then my grandmother passed it down to me. So now I have it. And I think that, of course, it's a beautiful piece of jewelry, but what is really emotional for me is that all of the stones in that piece of jewelry were mined from the land of the frontier province. So the stones were born from the same soil that my grandmother and her mother were born from. And it really, there's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something really intrinsic that binds us to the land that we belong to, even though we may have never stepped foot on that land. Immediately there's a sense of belonging when someone says Dera Ismail Khan. I know that I'm a part of that place, even though I've never been there, and I may never go there. So that, I think, is my favorite object.
No, thank you for sharing that. I'm just sat here really just listening, because it's just amazing just to hear these well, this is why I do this, because I just love having these conversations, and you get to learn so much out of just talking, really. Just moving on then, a number of things stand out by the time you finished your book, and the importance of those who witness partition placed on the soil of their homeland is something which, like you've pointed out a number of times, and something that comes up over and over again in the book. And I think it was quite interesting because I guess it being kind of born and brought up over in the UK, that connection to soil is not it's just, it doesn't exist. There's no way in hell I could say I feel connected to the soil in the UK. No. When I've been back to the Pind in India, or my paternal side of the family, you feel like you're stepping home. Even when we've gone back to the house they used to live in Kenya, again, you feel like you've almost you've come to somewhere comfortable and familiar. It was also interesting to see how many of them recall there was no religious discrimination prior to the years leading up to partition, and that amongst the murder, rape, and mayhem, there were constant swathes of people who went out of their way to help. I can't remember some of the exact examples in the book, but there were just there's a plethora of instances where, out of kind of sheer just lack of hope, just something that materializes. I think there was one where a gentleman had got a train to Delhi, I think, and there was a shop nearby, and they just happened to basically give him money, food, look after him. Yeah, and just look after him.
It's a restaurant in Amritsar.
That's it, yeah. And I just thought it's such a small thing. It's such a small kind of gesture to just to feed, clothe someone for a couple of days or just kind of help them on the way. And yet that probably saved his life, or that at least, yeah. And that probably.
I went to Crystal Restaurant. I go to it every time I'm in Amritsar. Anyone who's listening, Crystal Restaurant is amazing. I feel like I've been paid to. Tandoori chicken there is really good. Anyway, I went to Crystal Restaurant and I showed them my book and I said that, look, your ancestor did this. He saved all these people's lives, and they had no idea.
Oh.
And it was, but I mean, it was wonderful because I got to tell them about it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
They probably tell their children, and this is how the story will continue,
I think that's one thing that's really endearing and quite heartwarming about the book is that it's like, and I said it in the introduction, which is it's like a tapestry of just loads of different stories that weave together and connect, and I think it's brilliant that it's also having a real world impact. Obviously, people reading it changes their worldview. Conversations like this happen, but also though to go back and say, your ancestor, did you know your ancestor did this? If I learned that, I would have been like, oh wow, like I'm going to put that on the wall now. Thank you.
I know. But you feel like you are a part of these people's lives.
Yeah, especially after going through such kind of a pivotal part or kind of a life-changing part of their life. Like you're almost being let into like the depths of their soul almost. Just then kind of looking at everyone you got to talk to and all the conversations you had, besides some of the commonalities we've kind of already discussed, was there anything else that you picked up on in terms of like similarities or any differences between the people you spoke to?
Many of them couldn't understand why I wanted to talk about partition. It took a lot of, that's also primarily the reason why the object exists, so that I could use a catalyst for conversation. Because when I started talking about it at home, my grandparents would say, well, why do you want to know? What will it change? And for them, this was a really important question. What will it change? If we tell you the story, will India no longer be divided? Will we be home? Can we go back in the past? And while obviously that's not possible, I think what it would change is the perception of the past. But I think that when you know something like this about your family, the way you view them changes as well, and I don't know what they thought that I would think about them after the story emerged, because there's such a sense of shame attached to being made to flee from your home, living in refugee camps. Even that word, refugee, when my grandfather said it for the first time, he spat it out. Like there was it was such an unwanted, undesirable word. And and he tried very hard to rid himself of it, So I think that there was such a hesitation, a reticence to speak about those days, not just in my family, but so many others. And I should say that for most people, the story of partition has been a story of silence for a number of decades. And that silence has been practiced by the people who witnessed it for a number of reasons. Maybe they didn't want to go back to that time. Maybe they didn't have the words to talk about that time. Or maybe no one had ever asked them. You don't need someone to ask sometimes, I wasn't lucky enough for stories of partition to be embroidered through my childhood. That never happened to me. But I know people who actively heard about the other side. And I'm envious of that. because they know so much more than I know, even though I have spoken to so many people. So I think that using the object was a way for them to turn their attention away from themselves to this inanimate object, which obviously is a part of them. So, for instance, I said earlier that I never began or ended my conversation with partition because that's such a jarring way to begin, you know, to enter into such an intimate landscape so suddenly. So I would say things like, "Oh, you carried this pen from Pakistan to India? Why did you carry this pen? Your mother told you to carry it along with your college books. What college did you go to? And what language was the method of instruction? And did you get a newspaper at home? What language was that in? Is that where you learned about partition from?" So, what you're trying to understand is the social ethnography of what life was like before partition. Because I think I want to also clear out this misunderstanding right now that people think partition happened on a couple of days in August, or a couple of weeks in August, or a month in a year, whereas that is simply not the case. Partition is a process, and it existed and started far before August 14 or 15, 1947, and some would say it hasn't really quite settled even now. So I think that when you learn about undivided India, you need to learn about how life was before undivided India, so that you can learn about how life was fractured when India was divided. And I think using the object really helped in that because it populated the landscape. You learned about the house, you learned about the college, you learned about the school, you learned about the newspaper, the food, the friends, the girlfriends and boyfriends. And I think that's really like it makes it so much more human.
No, definitely, definitely. I think there was one story that stuck out about the gentleman who had loads of rugs. The
Yeah,
guy, yeah,
same,
that,
same story, the crystal story only.
yeah, that for me was. I was like,
Yeah,
why?
I mean,
Why has this guy got so many rugs for? And then obviously
can you
explains it.
imagine like just a room full of Persian rugs? How what an expensive room that would be.
It sounds like, but it sounds believable though as well. Because when I read it, I went,
Yeah,
"This is insane," and then I went, "Actually, I'm not surprised. Like
yeah.
this is what like people in the subcontinent are like. It's almost like
But
when
but would you be surprised if you saw a crocodile head on someone's wall?
yes, I even if I saw or even when I've seen taxidermy when like you go to certain places and you see it on like the walls and stuff, I'm always like Jesus, like that's intense. But then to hear that someone that was the item that they wanted to take over borders, like, hey, fair enough, like different strokes for different folks, right?
But next time you see anything taxidermy, I'm sure you're gonna ask the
Yes.
same way.
Next time I see my parents, I'm going to tell them about that as well. Like, I've had this podcast. I was talking to Aanchal, and this is what came out because it's one of those things where you are like, really, like, what? It is insane what
The
comes out.
other just now I'm thinking about it. The other weird things you get to learn, like somebody told me that their mother got jewelry across the border, but she put it inside achar pickle. So, but because the oil of the achar doesn't corrode the gold jewelry, and so the borders were manned by officers and police, and no one was going to check in a box of achar. So
No,
she put in all of this jewelry into the achar. And I thought
that's
that was so
clever.
clever. Yeah,
That
it
is
was
clever.
clever.
That is very, very clever. Um, so by the time I got to the end of the book, it kind of seemed like that you had fine-tuned a technique and a feel of kind of not only being able to help people kind of comfortably recall these memories, but it almost seemed like you had a very refined technique of knowing how to engage with these people so that they recall their stories without it being perhaps traumatic or kind of uncomfortable. Is that something that you kind of learn on the fly, or was there like a technique or kind of like was there some type of like planning beforehand to be all right, this is how I'm going to go with it? Because when I'm reading it, I was like, not only is this thoroughly engaging, but there is such a eloquence in how you've kind of got the person to talk, or you've had that conversation with that person and they've been freely kind of open with you. I think one one thing that I thought by the time I got to the end of the book was that you must now be an honorary member of loads of families across the subcontinent. Yeah, I
Yes.
thought so. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about how the chapters are placed in the book. Um, the order in which they are placed is not the order in which they happened. So, although the first chapter is about my family, and the last, which was recorded first in 2013, and the last chapter is the last interview I did in 2018. Yes. So, apart from those, the chapters in the middle are just arranged as per alphabetical order, and which also defies any further divisiveness between Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. So when you just arrange it as per alphabetical order, all divisiveness sort of is stripped away. But I think I'm realizing this as I was listening to you. Maybe what you were reading in the book is the fact that I was growing up. Like this book is my 20s. This book is my whole 20s. I started when I was 23. I finished when I was 28, 29. It was published in 2019 in the UK. You know, I literally grew up in this book. And I think what you're reading is growth. And maybe just people teaching me how to be more emotionally mature as I'm going along. Because there was no plan. I'm telling you, there was no. I didn't even know how to find people. Because when you're a 23-year-old girl who's been living in Canada for 7, 8 years and has basically forgotten how to speak her own mother tongue, how would I possibly know 18 or 80 or 90-year-olds to talk to about partition? I relied very heavily on people. And I think my methodology grew as I went on. Every interview, you would learn something. Every interview, you would gauge the threshold of your questioning. How much is too much? Have I pushed too much? Shall I put, just everything teaches you something about yourself, about the other person, about your relationship, about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, about what people thought of the British. There were so many things that I learned, but I could only do it on the job because I had no formal training. I knew how to engrave a metal plate in a bath with acid, but I didn't know how to have a fully structured conversation in Urdu with anyone, which I had to learn to do as well.
Yeah. No, I, f- as I already kind of mentioned, for me it was like it's a tremendous book, and I think what I definitely took out of it, or kind of what I try on top of obviously all the understanding that it brought. One thing that I definitely tried to take from it was the way within which you were engaging with people, because obviously on the podcast I have to engage with loads of people, and it's really interesting to see how you kind of just went with them or kind of worked with those people, and that I kind of took inspiration from it, and so hence why I kind of had to ask, because it's always just like as you're saying, kind of on the job you're learning. Similarly with this podcast, like I'm sure if people go back and listen to episode 1, it's completely different
Yes.
to now.
But I also think when you're working with like people that are in the twilight years of their life, 18, 90-year-olds, there are tangents that they go on. And I mean, you have to go with it because from within those tangents something really wonderful appears sometimes, but if you don't go with them on that journey, you may never find it. So we may be talking about partition, but 5 minutes later we may be talking about a really specific example of or a recipe of how to make samosas, and they're connected in some ways, and then we go on to talking about a manji, and then we go on to talking about fulkari bag, but it's all sort of connected. And I don't know, I would do it again, the whole thing.
I think the biggest kind of thing from the overall structure is that it just seems very natural. It just seems very like I could be sat there with my duddy talking
Yes,
about this.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was because, that's the only way these stories emerge, as stories, not as formal histories. So I didn't have a questionnaire. I didn't ask them any specific thing. All my questions, like you are doing right now, are born from the answers that they give, which gave me a little bit of freedom also. So, yes, we talked about partition and migration, but I also asked them, what did you wear as a child? And how did you do your hair? And these questions they found really funny. Like they found really funny. And I love that. Like I love that someone said to me that I wore a blue polka dot salwar kameez, and I remember it, and I tied something in the dupatta. But these things would never emerge if you go in with a questionnaire and are very strictly adhering to it,
No, definitely. And I think also those questions, like almost you have to almost let your guard down. Because if someone was like, oh, when you were 10, what did you learn at school, or what did you wear at school or something? When you think about it, you're automatically quite reminiscent, and then you go back into your past and your memories and all the rest of it. So I can see how
But
that
the other
works.
thing is that you have to be open to answering questions about yourself. And I had to learn this very early on, that if you are expecting someone to dive into probably the most intimate, unspoken part of their life, well, you should be able to answer the questions that they ask you. And I always invited people to ask me questions, and it was always conversational.
No, definitely. Okay, then kind of penultimate question.
Long tangent.
No, and this is why I love it. So no, thank you. There's kind of a couple of questions that we've got left. So one of them is then, after doing everything, doing the book, kind of you've published it, and it's kind of out there in the wider world. How did the whole process impact yourself, and what has some of the feedback been like?
I think it's always still very surreal to see someone with the book. I don't think I'll ever get over the fact that something I thought of in my head is a real thing and people are holding it. But I mean, maybe a lot of writers feel that way. So that's that. It's always overwhelming. What I love the most is when people read it and then talk to their families and come back with stories. This is how I know that it is making a difference, because people are being prompted to question things that they either did know or did not know before. And I think that that is the marker of real progress when it comes to the building of an organic historical archive. That we are all doing it on our own, and together it creates sort of a common shared history.
Yeah.
So that's something that I love. How has it changed me? Is that what you asked?
Yeah. So like, how do you, like, after everything's happened, how do you feel about it? Like, has it had an impact on you? And if it has, like, what has the impact been?
I feel a bit emotionally drained, to be honest. I haven't done field interviews for 2 years now because of the pandemic, and only now am I starting to feel a little bit lighter. But when you're speaking to people on an everyday basis, multiple times a week, it really starts to infiltrate your everyday. I used to have dreams about it, and I think this is very common for field researchers, particularly of traumatic events, that they begin to weave these events into their lives. It becomes so real. Stories become very, very real. I think because I started when I was 23, and I was very young, and I think I was forced to grow up and become quite mature very fast. I feel very serious after doing it, because this is a subject that deserves that seriousness. But I don't think I know how to be sort of like young and fun, anymore. I'm 31 years old, and I feel much older than that because of the emotional baggage that you've had to take care of for other people. It's very hard to hold on to other people's sadness. I would do it again in a heartbeat, but I'm just saying it's a very tedious thing, and you have to take care of it, and you are responsible for it, and you can't misuse it. So I just feel really drawn out.
No, I can appreciate that, especially with the kind of the heaviness of some of these stories, and like the traumatic experiences that people have witnessed firsthand. So no, that's absolutely fair. This is the last question, and there isn't really I don't think this necessarily has a definitive answer. But after doing all of your research, actually, hold on, let me rephrase that. So one thing that kept coming up in the book was a lot of people would almost point back to a time just before partition, or kind of slightly drawing it almost, where the communal tension, which is synonymous with partition, kind of doesn't exist. Everyone kind of made a point of, we all used to live together and there was never any friction, and we'd all go to different, like we'd all go to the same place to pray or to eat or whatever. Like there was a huge commonality which a lot of the chapters pointed out. Now, for you, doing all of your research, at what point do you think, or was it partition itself? Like, what was it that helped cause that switch in people? Because it almost seems as though a lot of the people you spoke to were like, something changed, something drastically evolved, and these people kind of were swept up in it. What, in your estimation, catalyzed this, or like helped this along?
I don't think there's a definitive answer for that because I wasn't there. But I will say this, that the announcement of partition created difference where there may have not been any difference, just from the simple assumption that Hindus and Muslims would now exist in India and Muslims would be in Pakistan, even though there were plenty of Muslims in India that continued to remain even after partition. So partition created difference where there may have not been any difference, or it augmented difference, or it elevated difference to a point that it came out, or it just inspired violence where there always had been overt difference. I wasn't there, so I can't say, but I know many people refer back to a time when things were civil, happy. I mean, when I think about it, it seems like a very idyllic, almost naive way to think about it because you know how history played out. But there were friendships and relationships that existed beyond the demarcations of religion and ethnicity. And no partition line is able to change that, take it away. The politics of that time didn't help, obviously. And I think that a lot of people who migrated thinking that it was temporary were often disappointed to learn that partition would be a permanent thing. Like there was like a disbelief to that. And I when I say this, I always think about the people who locked their houses on either side of the border and carried the keys and locks with them, and they were never able to go back, and those houses remained abandoned and locked, and those keys remained in their hands for the rest of their lives. This is something that's very common. But do I know why partition happened? Like, and I don't know, and I don't know if any scholar of now can say. We can only speculate.
Yeah.
Sorry if this is a disappointing.
No. I knew from the get-go that this wasn't going to be a question that got kind of like a black or white answer, but because
also, sorry to cut you off, but mind you, it may, this answer may be different for different people you ask.
Yeah.
So if you ask, you're asking me, but if you ask a Pakistani, or if you ask someone else, it may be a different answer. So it also depends on perspective.
Yeah, no, completely. I just thought it was interesting because a lot of people in the book made a point of there was a time where it wasn't like this, or they were like surprised at the violence, or a lot of them were kind of like, oh, we heard there was violence over there somewhere, and we never thought it would come to us because, hey, we live in a place where there's never been any kind of tension, and then all of a sudden it erupts. And so it was just interesting to see how, or in your estimation, what may or may not have kind of affected the change. And I guess you're right, like it's just speculation. It is definitely, I think, and there are so many, there would be a myriad of reasons as well. It could be opportunity, it could be religious difference that may have already been there, that's just been exacerbated.
Revenge, you heard that someone did this somewhere to your community, you're going to do this to that community.
I really do appreciate that. I just want to check, I've gone through all of the questions that I wanted to ask. I just wanted to double check if there was anything that you wanted to go over, or if you wanted anything you wanted to include.
I'm sorry, I feel like I've talked so much.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
I've really enjoyed it. I have to admit, like, this is probably one of the quickest podcasts that I've done. Like, sometimes these conversations last up to 3 or 4 hours, so
Oh, good. Okay.
don't
I
worry
thought
about
I
it.
was I thought I was just like, I think it's because I'm relatively quiet person in my personal life, but when I'm talking about remnants, I do talk a lot. So I always find it very jarring how much I'm speaking.
I could tell that you were in your element because like, whilst we were talking, I could almost see that you'd entered into your domain and you were like, "Yep, I'm like this is mine." And it's really
But
endearing to see it.
oh, thank you. That's really sweet. But the thing is, now I'm looking back, all of my answers are in hindsight, and I think that I am seeing myself grow as I'm looking back, right? So I think it's been a really insightful conversation for me as well.
No, I'm glad. I'm glad. Why don't you basically tell everyone listening who the publishers are depending on what country they're in, and also that I know we've discussed it, but just the title of the book, just so that someone in the UK isn't looking for remnants of a separation. It's like that doesn't exist. But yeah, no. Please feel free.
So if you are in the UK or the US or Canada or anywhere outside of South Asia, the book is called Remnants of Partition and it's published by Hearst, and it has this beautiful cover of a Punjabi nale that I use to tie up a salwar. If you are in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka or Nepal, you will probably get Remnants of a Separation, which is published by HarperCollins India. And if you prefer a Hindi edition, or a Punjabi edition, or a French edition, those are also available.
Now that you've made it to the end, and as promised, here's a few bloopers of me trying to record for parts of this podcast. Yeah, you can tell I'm still a little bit rough around the edges. So you finally made it. So as promised, you made it to the end. As promised, if you make it to the end,